Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
The strange rebirth of Labour England has come as a surprise, even to me. Despite a tidal wave of negativity, much of it from his own side, Jeremy Corbyn achieved the greatest increase in the Labour vote since Clement Attlee in the historic landslide of 1945. Yes, that's right, Jeremy Corbyn outperformed Hugh Gaitskell, Harold Wilson, Jim Callaghan, Michael Foot, Neil Kinnock, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown and Ed Miliband. As the Americans say, who'd have thunk it?
The Labour Party has tripled in size in the Corbyn three-year era. It is bigger than all the other parties put together. It has millions in the bank. It is the biggest left-wing party in Europe, and it is the bookies' favourite to form the next British government.
Our first guest is an eminent Labour historian and biographer. From Attlee to Blair to Miliband, he has chronicled them all. His latest book, co-authored with former Tribune editor Mark Seddon, now at the UN in New York, is marvellously entitled The Strange Rebirth of Labour England. He's Francis Beckett, and he joins us now. Welcome back, Francis.
Thank you, George.
We'll come to your book in a minute, but you and I go back a long way with each other and with the Labour Party. This is all a bit of a surprise, isn't it?
It's an amazing surprise. It's an amazing turn-up, and nobody, as you were saying in your introduction, would have believed it. When Jeremy Corbyn was elected, everybody thought that he wasn't going to survive very long. He himself was absolutely amazed to be elected. The turning point, of course, was the election that Theresa May called quite unnecessarily in the hope of permanently ditching an unpopular Labour Party, in the hope that
she would. Unpopular.
She would.
Yeah.
Sorry.
She thought it was
unpopular. Yeah.
She thought it was terminally unpopular. She thought the leader was terminally unpopular, and Corbyn himself. I have to say, Corbyn himself went into that election assuming that he was going to come out of it very, very badly beaten. I think that he probably expected that the day after polling day he would be writing his resignation statement as leader. But something quite extraordinary happened, and he almost overturned the sitting government. He deprived Theresa May of her parliamentary majority. It was the most extraordinary turnaround. I saw him speak the night before polling day. He looked tired. He looked as though he just had to go through the motions until it was all over. 10 o'clock that night, when the exit poll came out and he heard it, I'm told that he perked up instantly, and he hasn't been looking tired ever since. Now, suddenly, he looks like a winner.
How does, even as I listen to you describe it, and I know it all, of course, I can hardly believe it. I have to pinch myself to believe that it's real. Your book describes not just what we've just agreed, but how this may have happened. So tell the viewers, because the book is pre-orderable now. I've pre-ordered it already, and everyone else should, because it's going to be a bestseller. But give an insight to the viewers on how all this happened.
The book starts in 1978, and that's really the late 70s, when what we're calling Labour England, I don't mean the Labour Party, but Labour England, that sort of strange, almost mystical amalgam of things that includes the Labour Party, the trade unions, adult education institutes, places like the City Lit, the local services, local comprehensive, powerful Labour councils, the whole panoply of things that go to make up Labour England, that were at their height in the late 70s. And you and I can remember what England was like then, and people will tell you that the late 70s was a dreadful place to live in. Well, in a lot of ways, of course it was. But
I'll go back to it in a minute myself.
I know, I'm afraid I do too. But in many, many ways, it was a far, far better place to live in than the England that we have to live in now.
Were you surprised on Life on Mars when the policeman had a choice of staying in the present or leaping off a roof back to the 1970s, and he chose the latter? But let's not digress.
Yeah.
That came to a crashing end with Thatcher's victory in 1979, and that might have been the end of it.
Well, it might have been the end of it. there seemed a hope that it was not going to be the end of it because the next Labour government would reverse it. Because what happened was, of course, that Thatcher, who understood exactly what Labour England was, not just the Labour Party, but all the other things I've described, she knew exactly what it was. She knew that that's what you had to destroy if you were going to destroy Labour England. She was a very intelligent, very determined, and in her own way, very principled woman. She understood exactly what needed to be done. She set about doing it. Now, there was enormous hope that with the next Labour government, that process was going to be reversed, that the supertanker was going to be turned round, as Attlee turned the supertanker around in 1945. And so it might have been under any other Labour leader. So it might have been, in my view, under Neil Kinnock, had he become Prime Minister. So it might have been, I think, under John Smith, had he lived to become Prime Minister. But John Smith's death brought to the Labour leadership Tony Blair, who didn't understand Labour England the way Margaret Thatcher didn't understand much about it, but did know that he didn't like it very much. And so instead of the supertanker being turned around, it remained steaming in exactly the same direction, perhaps with a little, perhaps with a few ameliorations like the national minimum wage, but not a huge amount. Now, what I think that did was that it told the young that there was nothing to be hoped for from conventional politics. Now, if the young are told that, if the young believe that there is nothing to be hoped for from conventional politics, what can happen? The worst that can happen is that it can result in riots. The best that can happen is that that idealism can be channeled somewhere else. And I think that moment came partly because of the changes that Ed Miliband made to the Labour Party constitution. That moment came with the chance to make the most unlikely person possible, Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party, and then to make the most unlikely person possible a serious contender for Prime Minister. And suddenly, I think they can see that there is hope from the political process. The political process isn't something just to be abandoned, forget about. You either you forget about it and you live with the society you have, or you riot in the streets for a better one. There's no third alternative. What Jeremy Corbyn said is, in effect, this is not his words, but the effect of his presence was to say, actually, there is a way. There may be a way, using the democratic political process that we have to turn the supertanker around, to do what was done in 1945, to do it again.
Now, you're a biographer of Clement Attlee. It's said that he was not much fun at parties, and now they're saying Jeremy Corbyn is a rather boring fellow, which has some truth to it, by the way. I speak as someone who sat next to him for 30 years, literally. But Attlee and Corbyn are the perfect authentication of Labour England, aren't they?
They are.
They're principled, they're sincere, they're not people on the make, they are transparently, I would argue, people who want to do good for others. Is that what's attracting people?
I think what unites the two of them is that they're both in politics to do something rather than in being in politics to be something. Yeah. I think that's what holds them together. Of course, you can't carry the analogy too far. Jeremy Corbyn is not an Attlee figure. Attlee could not have lived Jeremy Corbyn's political life. Attlee would never, Attlee's style throughout his political life was to make the compromises, to go into Ramsay MacDonald's cabinet. Ramsay MacDonald was a kind of Tony Blair figure of the 30s, and Tony Blair I've always thought was Ramsay MacDonald on steroids. And Jeremy Corbyn could not have lived Attlee's political life because Jeremy Corbyn's style is not to make the compromises, but rather to do without power if getting power involves the compromises. So they come from a completely different standpoint. Attlee wouldn't have approved of Jeremy Corbyn's purism about politics and about socialism. He always thought that purism in the Labour Party was utterly destructive. Also, neither of them, it should be said, are much good as public speakers. Before he became leader, I spoke at a debate with Jeremy Corbyn, the two of us against two journalists who were in favour of Tony Blair. And I mean, he made a perfectly competent case, but there was nothing exciting about him. There was nothing that you thought, oh, we must follow this man. But he is somebody who believes something and who, if he becomes Prime Minister, will sort of quietly sit there, and if he can, he'll get on with doing it.
Yeah.
Francis, he gave this important speech this week in Edinburgh. And if he was unpopular in the media before this, he's going to be much more unpopular now, isn't he? Tell us about his proposals.
Well, I think one should say firstly that Jeremy Corbyn, and I don't think we should be uncritical about Jeremy Corbyn. He is the author of he is partly the author of his own misfortunes with the media. He makes himself too unavailable. He has this, he's now famous for insisting that he'll only take one question from broadcasters, and so if he avoids that one question, he can walk away. Yeah. It's a very bad method, and I fear he's listening to some very bad media advice. But his ideas for pursuing the media are really interesting. The idea that on a large paper, the journalists might elect their own editor rather than having an editor, and that you could enshrine that in statute, is one of the most interesting and creative ideas, but it's one I think that will be enormously difficult to carry through. There's another idea, though, that he came up with in Edinburgh that is eminently practical and actually a Labour government could carry through quite quickly. He's proposing that a number of the trustees of the BBC should be directly elected by the people rather than appointed by government. Now, that's something you could do very fast, and would change the nature of things, because the idea of having a public service broadcaster is a good one, but the danger of it is that it will be in the pockets of the government, because the government appoints all the trustees and controls the purse strings. And that, I think, is why the BBC fell apart over Iraq. Because the BBC did something the government didn't like and was forced then not only to fire the journalist responsible, but to fire the Director General and the Chairman. Exactly. And that would all change under Corbyn's proposal.
All change. Now, the book is out in a couple of weeks' time. It can be pre-ordered from all the usual places. The Strange Rebirth of Labour.
Jeremy Corbyn and the Strange Rebirth of Labour England.
Perfect title. And two great authors, Francis Beckett and Mark Seddon. Thanks for joining us, Francis.
Thank you.